All right, good morning, everyone. Dr. Randall Gates, board-certified chiropractic neurologist, also a chiropractic physician at Gates Way to Health. And today we're talking about dizziness and gluten. If you have dizziness and you're not getting better, you may want to think about gluten. Gluten, the taboo subject that Kathy and I talk about a lot. And good morning, Kathy. How are you?
Good morning, everyone.
I'm doing well, doing well. So, when it comes to gluten, Kathy and I have been discussing this topic relative to myriad of disorders. As we say, it seems to come up every week and for good reason. And last week we talked about, a psychiatric disorder and gluten. This week we're circling back to dizziness. We talked about dizziness for, close to 2 months, different dizziness conditions and how it tied in. We talked about Meniere's disease and vestibular neuritis and Maladé-Barkman syndrome and our experiences, and basically today we're giving you a little more about our experience in gluten. So Kathy, did you have any questions or thoughts that you want to go with first?
Well, number one, gluten does affect tons more things than just dizziness.
Right.
I had the research up this morning. I thought, okay, everybody should just get this in a paper and read it, and then maybe they figure out that just start moving, you're going to feel a lot better. In this realm, why don't you give us an idea of what's going on in the brain, or what does the gluten do, and where does it go, and how does it cause dizziness?
Yeah, and I think just even that relationship of how does gluten cause dizziness? If you're going to have a gluten problem, aren't you going to have a gut problem, right? Which is what we'd all think of. And this is taking us into the field of what's called gluten-related disorders. And when they started studying gluten, they found some research that said, yes, people who have gluten intolerance have digestive symptoms. Other research came out and said, no, they don't have digestive symptoms. So if you're reading anything that's anti-gluten per se, where they're saying, gluten is not a real thing, or gluten intolerance is not a real thing, and those people who are saying they're gluten intolerant, they're really just faking it and they're making it up, that's based on some of what I just talked about. Well, the definitive thing about gluten reactions are neurological impairments and neurological problems. Going back to 2013, I believe the gentleman's name is Peter Gibson, and he's from Australia. He heads a lab there. He was the guy that defined this entity called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And I don't know if it was because of pressure or what, he did this big research study where he basically had people who had irritable bowel syndrome, like myself, consume gluten and dairy, consume just gluten, or consume basically no gluten, no dairy. But they didn't really know what they were eating. So it's like you're eating a pancake and you don't know what's in it. And he showed that those who ate gluten and dairy did feel worse digestively, but those who just had gluten did not feel worse digestively. So when the study hit mainstream media, they started saying, all of you gluten-free fanatics are just that, you're fanatics, and it's not based on science. Well, he did another study that didn't hit the mainstream media, based on what I saw, where he showed that the people who said they didn't feel well when they ate gluten actually felt depressed. So he showed that the people who were not feeling good when they ate gluten were feeling dysphoria. They just did not feel as well. So they had a neurological impairment. And there's this guy by the name of Dr. Hadjivasulu. Forgive me if I'm butchering his name, but he's out of the United Kingdom, and he's one of the lead researchers at what's called the Sheffield Ataxia Center. So ataxia is where individuals have very poor balance. It's those people you see at the mall and they're walking and they're kind of shuffling and their feet are wide apart like they're on a cruise ship, which is in 20-foot seas, and they may have a cane. And so he studies ataxia patients, and ataxia patients can have a variety of different causes. They can be genetic, but he coined this term called gluten ataxia. So gluten ataxia was coined around 2000, 2002, and he started showing that people who had gluten intolerance could have ataxia. So Kathy, am I answering the question thus far? I know I kind of went on a tangent.
I think so. Yeah.
All right, so I'll keep going. Okay, I'll keep going. So he starts studying these gluten ataxia patients, and he finds some really interesting statistics. So lots of times ataxia patients are told, we don't know what's wrong with you, because the genetic causes are really complicated. For example, there's this entity called spinocerebellar ataxia, and there are upwards of 30 different variants of it. And genetic testing is not just like, you know, $100 test. We're talking many, many thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars to pin down which type you have. So a lot of them are told, you know, we don't really know, your grandpa had ataxia, it's probably genetic. Well, Dr. Hajivasulu started investigating these individuals and doing gastroenterology type examinations where he'd have them see a gastroenterologist. He's a neurologist. So he has them see a GI specialist. They're doing endoscopies. They're going down into their intestines, and they are not complaining of things like diarrhea or constipation or stomach pain after eating gluten. And he finds that a lot of them have inflammation in their intestines, akin to what you would see in a celiac disease patient. So celiac disease is where somebody eats gluten and then their immune system like kills their intestine. You have these little fingers in your intestines called villi, and in a celiac disease patient, rather than looking like a sea anemone, they look like these little nubs. So they went in there and they saw like all this inflammation in these ataxia patients, and he found that upwards of 40% of spontaneous ataxia patients or sporadic ataxia patients had this gluten antibody issue. So then they start going in and they start looking at their cerebellum on imaging, and he finds that gluten ataxia patients, so again, going back, they have immune reactions to gluten in their gut, that the gluten antibodies are attacking their cerebellum. Brain model, cerebellum. So he found that the antibodies were literally killing the Purkinje cells of the cerebellum. Now, probably a lot of you hear me mention Purkinje cells a lot. I'm trying to pull the brain model apart. So your cerebellum kind of looks like a tree. I don't know if you guys can see that. So you can see all those little lines. Oh, okay, it's always backwards. Okay, there we go. All right. So you see these little lines in here? Well, those lines look kind of like a tree. And the outer perimeter of the cerebellum is made of Purkinje cells. Purkinje cells, in essence, inhibit what's deep down in the cerebellum. So we have these deep cerebellar nuclei. As Kathy and I have been talking about, the vestibular system, the inner ear, it actually functions as a deep cerebellar nuclei, and it's the Purkinje cells which are trying to inhibit everything down here. Well, if you don't have good inhibition, then you're not going to have a nice movement. So that may look like I'm reaching out to grab my cup of coffee and I'm going like this as I'm going in to take a sip. Or that may look like I stand up and I lose my balance, or I can't walk in a coordinated fashion. So Dr. Hajivasulu showed that these ataxia patients have antibodies to gluten, and the gluten antibodies literally kill the cerebellum. So I think I'll pause there, Kathy. What thoughts do you have, questions before we go on?
There's just so much of it. Even having dinner with friends last night, but, you know, the bread's on the table, and I'm like, there's bread there if everyone's eat it, and everybody's like, no, we stay away from carbs. All right, oh, so you stay away from gluten? No, we're staying away from carbs. I said, well, I'll stay away from gluten too.
Right.
And we're all older folks, and I'm like, okay, well, you know, every week that we do these shows with you, it's like, whatever condition we talk about, I mean, 95% of the time, gluten is associated in some way.
Right.
And I mean, today I looked up the 14, you know, kind of symptoms of brain fog, you know, people with anxiety, depression. There's so many things that tie in with gluten, and your ability to connect what goes on with the gut and then how it gets to the brain, or if it just goes directly to the brain, whatever's going on, especially like in the dizziness. I just find it amazing. So we sat there and I said, well, you know, gluten helps eat the nerve, you know, the myelin nerves, so that kind of brings on neuropathy. And we're older folks. We know lots of people with neuropathy. And they're like, are you kidding me? Just eating gluten is going to give me neuropathy? It's not going to help, you know? There's a lot of other things that you're going to look at that's going to happen. Your nervous system, your gut, your brain, it just affects almost everything in your body.
It does, yeah. And Dr. Hajivasulu was one of the main people researching that. Yeah, and just on that point, Basically, when he came out and showed that the Purkinje cells of the cerebellum are being attacked by gluten antibodies, they then started studying just celiac disease patients. So you take somebody with celiac disease, it could be an 18-year-old man, it could be a 27-year-old woman. She's presenting to a GI clinic with gastrointestinal symptoms. They've investigated everything, colonoscopy, endoscopy. She doesn't have cancer, he doesn't have cancer, but they have celiac disease. So Dr. Hajivasulu took these patients and they started doing these neurological investigations. And we'll talk about some of the brain MRIs that he was doing, but they also start studying for things like neuropathy and finding that celiac disease patients, a large percentage of them actually present with neuropathy. A lot of them have numbness and tingling in their feet. And they're not even thinking about it because their digestive symptoms are so bad. Point being, also that when we have immune reactions to gluten, we also develop these things called ganglioside antibodies. Ganglioside antibodies are one of the principal antibodies seen in conditions like chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyradiculopathy, aka the chronic form of Guillain-Barré, one of the more common causes of peripheral neuropathy aside from diabetes. So yes, and then gluten, Dr. Hajivasulu also showed in 2006 that like 30% of people with neuropathy have gluten antibodies. These gluten antibodies also attack peripheral nerve tissue. Okay, keep going, Kathy. Sorry, my little interjection.
Okay, we got another thing we can keep whenever you're younger. Okay, if you have diabetes when you're younger, okay, this is just a side effect. But as you get older, then people need to, you need to pay attention to when you're younger, because if you get older, then you're really up a creek, because then you're all risk every time you turn around, your balance is off, everything's terrible. And I took my mother-in-law to the neurologist, and they do the thing and bring your finger around and touch your nose. Well, when you bring your finger around it, you can't find your nose. That's pretty much a clue that you don't know where you are and your brain's not working properly. And but I mean, all of these types of things, they're just going to impact greatly as you get older.
Yeah.
So think of it as just prolonged abuse to your body, to your body and your brain, your gut, the whole deal. And if you take anything, you hit something with a ball bat a couple times, maybe it gets a couple things, you keep hitting.
Right.
And it's not going to look very good.
Right.
It's going to be pretty much demolished. And unfortunately, that's kind of what you can do to your body with all of this. And go back to, okay, everybody's sitting there going, okay, so now we're talking about this gluten stuff. It just sounds like new age stuff that people are getting, reading for to look for issues. And we go back all the time and say, yes, this was not a common thing 100 years ago, 50 years ago. It has to do with our food source. It has to do with the grains.
Right.
And how they're now produced. So,
right.
So if you're thinking, we're just pulling smoke, more and more people, I talked to people dinner last night, gave them a few, symptoms, that sort of stuff, and I'm like, holy crap, I got all that.
Right.
Okay. This is what we're eating. So pay attention, and every time you talk to someone who, like myself, is pretty much gluten-free, we talk more and more about what's available, what's out there, what you can eat, what the alternatives are, and how much healthier people. There are tons of people that are eating healthier than they did 10 years ago.
Right. Right.
But it has such an impact, and everything that you see in your practice, from the dizziness to the celiac, the IBS, all that stuff. Gluten's at the base of all of it, correct?
It is. It's a big piece to all of it, because whether or not gluten is the primary cause of the condition, gluten is a toxin to the intestinal protein that binds each intestinal cell together. So when we talk about leaky gut syndrome, which is a horrible term, I wish people didn't start using that 20 years ago, but that's the term in the literature, and gluten literally causes leaky gut syndrome. So now you take a Crohn's disease patient or an ulcerative colitis patient, it's all throughout the literature that they have abnormal populations of gut bacteria. It's all throughout the literature they have leaky gut syndrome that causes their immune system to freak out and then attack their intestines. Well, now you're eating gluten. Gluten's not the primary cause of their problem, but it's going to make matters worse, so to speak, for them.
But it does eat the stomach lining, right?
Well, yeah, so gluten is going to break down the intestinal lining, which is then going to allow leaky gut to be worse, which will then inflame the rest of the process.
Right.
Okay.
It is a big deal.
Okay, perfect.
All right, so what else we got here?
I think it would be good if I talk about some of the studies he's doing. So just for people to know.
Okay.
So Dr. Hajivasuli, he keeps coming out with really great studies. And another really strong thing is that he works at, well, at least in part at this ataxia center. And at this ataxia center, they did a study in 2017 where they took over, I think it was around 120 patients with gluten ataxia. Now, ataxia is not a super common neurological problem, and so for him to get 120 gluten ataxia patients is pretty remarkable. So it's good data. So he took them and he said, okay, you have gluten ataxia, and 68, I think, were very strict on their gluten-free diet. And then it was something like 30 some odd of them were saying they were strict, but he questioned how strict they were based on their blood tests. And then another percent, whatever the leftovers were, they basically weren't strict. They didn't go on a gluten-free diet. They couldn't do it. It was like 67 out of the 68 that were adhering to the gluten-free diet. He saw that their antibodies went down significantly. Like their antibodies were gone to gluten. So he's like, okay, you're saying you're on a gluten-free diet. There's no signs that you're eating gluten based on your blood test. And they did MRI studies called MR spectroscopy. What is spectroscopy? Well, anytime you have a friend who takes like a drug test, or if you know an athlete who is suspected of taking something like steroids, they do spectroscopy. Spectroscopy is a tool used in chemistry that basically can tell how many like hydrogen atoms are in certain things, and they can see this molecular signature, so to speak, of a molecule. And so there's something called MR spectroscopy where they can see the molecular signature of certain molecules in different parts of the brain. And so he went in and did MR spectroscopy on these gluten ataxia patients. So he found that when 67 out of 68 went gluten-free, really gluten-free, their antibodies went down, and he saw a huge improvement in their MRI scans. Basically, he was looking at a ratio of an inflammatory to non-inflammatory byproduct, and he found that that is called NAA to creatinine ratio improved significantly. So that's a big deal. He's also shown in other studies that gluten ataxia patients have atrophy within their cerebellum. Also, for all of those of you who've had MRI scans, the standard MRI scan is nothing like what he is doing. It's more general. What he's doing is more specific. Also, he found that it's not just the entire cerebellum that was affected. He found it's this center portion called the vermis. Vermis in Latin means worm. So if you look at the cerebellum on end, and I know the lighting's not great, but they call it the vermis because it looks like a worm. I guess it probably looks more like a worm if you put both pieces of cerebellum together. But anyways, so that's what he found. And then he found that for those who were saying they were gluten-free, but their blood tests weren't really showing that they were gluten-free, he suspected that they weren't completely gluten-free. He saw some improvements in this region of the cerebellum again, but in that NAA to creatinine ratio, but not as significant in the ones who had a huge drop in their gluten antibodies. And then he also showed that those who were not on a gluten-free diet and that their ratios continued to get worse. So for anybody who's questioning gluten right there, I think that's some pretty powerful evidence. He's shown that antibodies to gluten attack the cerebellum. They kill Purkinje cells. That's been shown definitively. And then he's shown that if you have a gluten problem and you go on a gluten-free diet, your MRI scan, particularly in this part of the cerebellum, which controls the inner ear, which dampens inner ear activity, which is heavily, very, very important in inner ear function, that area improves. And if you don't go on a gluten-free diet and you have gluten antibodies, this area gets worse. Now, the questioning person would say, well, you're talking about gluten ataxia here in this setting, but you are talking about dizziness in general for this topic. And I'd say absolutely, because we, Kathy and I, need to talk about what we're seeing, because lots of times what doctors see are years ahead of research articles that are going to come out, because we have to talk about these things for them researchers to say, okay, let's do a research study on this. So what I will say in our experience is that for a lot of patients who have nebulous dizziness syndromes, and I mean nebulous in the kindest way, but they may have something like PPPD that we've talked about, or Meniere's disease, you may have vestibular migraines, you may have Maladé-Barkman syndrome. One of these conditions, we find commonly, not all the time, but commonly, these individuals have antibodies to gluten. So wouldn't it make sense, based on everything we've said, that we know gluten attacks the cerebellum, we know going gluten-free in these individuals helps their cerebellum to function better and be less inflamed. If somebody has a dizziness syndrome that's not improving with vestibular rehab, and these people have been to the top specialists in their area, sometimes they've traveled across the country to see other specialists with no improvement, wouldn't it make sense that if they have gluten antibodies, A, to be tested for gluten antibodies, and B, and then to go off gluten and do their rehab and see how they improve? That's what we're saying. So just letting you know that we're finding this condition a lot. So your thoughts, Kathy?
A lot for the dizziness, a lot for everything, and just quickly, if you look up, different things that gluten can cause, you've got migraine headaches, dizziness or brain fog, chronic fatigue syndrome, digestive issues, swelling and inflammation of your joints. There's just so much stuff there that people don't relate. And, I've worked with you for years and have been pretty steadfast on my gluten denial. I give it up, but then every now and then I cheat.
Right.
But we both know I've had a big run of headaches here of late, and we're trying to figure out what other food it is. So, I mean, whether it's the gluten or not, the bloating, the diarrhea, constipation, there's so many things that go with it. Abdominal pain, just feeling tired, skin problems, psoriasis, different stuff like that. That nobody relates to that. I mean, you watch all the commercials for all the different medicines and stuff people are supposed to use for this, but again, it's another autoimmune condition caused in part by this neurotoxin gluten.
I'm with you. Yeah. And GI toxin, for sure. I'm with you 100%. And then we had somebody pose, you were talking about migraines and brain fog and all these other conditions, fibromyalgia. One of our listeners posed, how can it relate to fibromyalgia? Well, that's the Rheumatology International Journal from 2014, where they took 20 fibromyalgia patients. They did a similar thing as Dr. Hajivasulu. They went and did an endoscopy, and they saw they didn't have celiac disease, because that's the question we always get. Well, do I have celiac disease? Most of you don't have celiac disease. Celiac disease only affects 1 out of 100 people. But non-celiac gluten sensitivity affects 10 to 20% of the population. I hesitate because research articles say different things. Some say 10%, some say 20%, some say 15%. Needless to say, it's a large percentage. And so you probably don't have celiac disease, but in this study on fibromyalgia, they went in and they did an endoscopy, and they saw they didn't have celiac disease, but they had signs of like a gray area of celiac disease. They saw these fibromyalgia patients had intraepithelial lymphocytosis, which just means the villi that are in the intestines, and they could see lots of immune cells in these villi, which you shouldn't see. So they put them on gluten-free diets, and over, I think it was 8 months, every person in the study had improvement to some degree. Either they got completely off their medications, or they were able to go back to work, or they had a significant improvement in their activities of daily living. So yeah, gluten relates to everything that we're talking about, as Kathy has mentioned.
It's extremely all-encompassing. Even just telling the story of my granddaughter last night at dinner, because we were talking gluten, and I was talking about the activity-induced asthma that she had when she was playing soccer.
Oh yeah.
And you mentioned, I asked you at the time, since I was going gluten-free, can that affect something like that? And you're shaking your head before I even get the question out of my mouth. But yeah, for sure it does. And everybody thinks I get weird responses when I say, no, 2 weeks. I told her mother we took her off of gluten in 2 weeks. She was running miles and keeping up with her mom that runs quite a bit. And no inhaler, no red face, no looking like she's going to pass out. And that just made such an extreme change. And even the stuff I read this morning, because I usually tell people, give it 2 weeks. If you go totally gluten-free for 2 weeks, you will see a difference. You will feel a difference. maybe not, I mean, some people more than others.
Right.
But I still say that difference will start showing up. And if you see even an inkling of a change, I would be on board to stay on it and see what else transpires. But as the articles say too, gluten is not the only thing that people can have intolerance to. So whether it's dairy or something else, there's a whole plethora of things out there that you're going to touch upon that can be bringing up different symptoms. But for what you're talking about, or a lot of the work that you do with autoimmune, gluten is one of the huge culprits at the base of all of it.
Yeah, and we had one listener say, so would you say going off gluten, it will take a month to notice improvement or maybe longer? And I'd say, yeah, I'd start with the 2 weeks. In that 2-week period, lots of times people will eat gluten and then they'll notice a change. Why? Because it's like you have immune cells that are used to dumping things like histamines and inflammation. So every time you eat gluten, this is why we don't feel horrible, because we're always doing it. It's like your immune cells just go, bah, bah. They're vomiting out these histamines. Well, then you don't eat gluten for a period of time, and they start swelling with like histamines. And then you eat gluten, and then they just dump it all out, or you make a ton of gluten antibodies. And so then you may feel not so good. And that's why it's really important to give yourself a month. And as Kathy knows, and as I know, as we go through this, try it for 2 weeks, like Kathy is saying, try it for a month. I'm not giving you medical advice. I'm not telling you to do this, but I'm just saying in general, this is what we do. If you were to try it for a month, then maybe you'll feel better. And they've shown that it takes at least a month for the gluten to get out of the intestinal system, at least a month. And they've done studies in celiac disease patients where just even a little bit of gluten is a problem. And that's what Dr. Hadjivassulu was alluding to, because he had this, sometimes the tests don't lie. In his MRI studies, basically showed that some people who say they're going gluten-free, we can see that they're not quite gluten-free, and they may not even know it. Maybe you're getting it from your chapstick. Maybe you're getting it, and I'm not trying to create hysteria either here, and I'm not saying you need to change your shampoos and everything that can be talked about in the celiac disease world, but being aware of the soy sauces, being aware of the barbecue sauce, be aware of things that you wouldn't necessarily consider have gluten, something like rye. A lot of people are not aware that rye has gluten in it. So that's what I would impart there, Kathy. Your thoughts?
Very much what you said. I mean, your salad dressing, your ketchup, your mustard, it's easy to find them that don't have it, and they go on the other area. Somebody said something to me that you said a month to get it out of your stomach. Somebody mentioned to me a really long period of time to get it out of your brain. What kind of number do you have on that?
I mean, I don't know how long that takes. That's a really good question. I should investigate that. So maybe I can come back next week with that, because I would probably be able to see that, and it's probably in one of these articles. I must have missed it. So I don't know.
And I
can't say
think
for
it
sure.
Was the lady I was telling you about the other day that is the dentist that I talked to, and I thought, I thought she was saying something like, double check it, and I don't want to misquote or whatever, but it was months or something, and I'm like, it's in my brain that long. Okay, I know in my gut, things move in your gut, and it's gonna dissipate faster. But once it gets into your brain and it's causing the damage that it does, then if you can force Dr. Gates, find out how long that takes, because I think that would be really interesting to see how long that's in there and what kind of damage that's doing while it's there.
Right. Exactly. I could speak to the damage, but how long? I mean, I know approximately I use a month, but Dr. Hadjivassulu has one of the best studies with, the 120 patients that I commented on. So I'll have to track from the initial point that they did the MRI to the second point that they did the MRI and the gluten antibodies. I think it's around 6 months, but I could be off. And then we had another question. Can you please address the gluten-free breads? Are they really gluten-free? So a lot of them really are gluten-free, but they're not grain-free. So they're full of rice and corn, and they're very high carb. And in my experience, what I can say is that they don't initially pose a problem, but when people consume them at a high level, they consume a lot of it, kind of like our standard American diet. Now we're having toast for breakfast, we're having a sandwich for lunch, that then it changes the gut bacteria in a negative fashion. Lots of times the improvements we see initially then start to go away. So I'm not saying gluten-free bread is bad, but that's why I am a firm believer in grain-free bread. Just do a little plug for Fresh Baked Paleo. I think they have great products. For those of you who've tried them, awesome stuff. That's what I eat. So, and then We had one last question. Histamine reactions like pruritus and polycythemia. Polycythemia can be a little more complicated, so I can't necessarily say that gluten causes polycythemia. It could be part of the pruritus, and histamine reactions. I have seen that relationship. So that's what I'd say there. So any closing thoughts, Kathy? Because we're a little over. We're at about a half hour now.
Well, we'll wrap it up. I will leave them with this one thing, since we talked about the gluten-free breads and the grains and so forth. And yeah, you're not going to have a gluten reaction probably, but don't think of them as being diet foods, because they have plenty of calories.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
when I decide I want like a grilled cheese or something, and I buy gluten-free bread, good. I will gain weight.
Oh yeah.
Always.
Yeah. I was never so heavy when I was completely gluten-free. And I was eating a loaf of gluten-free bread a day, which had even more carbs than the standard bread. So yeah, it's easy to fall into that trap. It's very easy to fall into that trap. So yeah, I would agree with you there. All right, anything else, Kathy?
No, I think we're good. Double check that brain thing on how long the gluten stays in there. I thought 6 months is what this lady said to me, but if we can get a specific, that'd be a really good answer to have. But other than that, I think you've given us a really lot of good information this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So if you know someone with dizziness who's not getting better, you may want to have them watch this video, have them watch our other videos, bring this information to light. We just want a grassroots movement for those who are not getting answers. So hopefully this helps. I hope you all have a really nice weekend, and we'll put this on YouTube because for some reason we couldn't get YouTube working today. So have a good weekend, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.